9 days later, under the shade of a great ceiba tree, General Shafter began negotiations for the surrender of Santiago. As commanding general of the army, Nelson Miles had warned President McKinley. Disease struck U.S. soldiers.
He knew, and it was certain, and in fact it did happen, that virtually all the American troops were going to get malaria. And as many as 25% of them would be down at any one time. And by down, I mean flat on the back, unable to operate at all. And then in July, the yellow fever was going to start.
The growing death toll convinced General Shafter to accept the conditional surrender of Santiago. Spain could not afford to ship its own army back from Cuba. Shafter agreed to send home 23,000 Spanish soldiers at U.S. expense. Disease would take the lives of more than 2,000 U.S. troops, nearly 5 times the number of fatalities from combat.
Each morning we would hear bugles blowing taps very shortly after reveille. First the burial detail, then the bugle. The sickness was striking in harder. One bugle followed another throughout the day, almost as if they were but echoes among the hills. Private Charles Post, 71st Infantry.
On July 17th in Santiago's main square, U.S. and Spanish generals assembled for the formal surrender of the city. When the cathedral's clock struck noon, the Spanish flag, which had flown over Santiago for nearly 400 years, was replaced by the stars and stripes, not the flag of Cuba Libre. Cuban insurgents were not invited to attend.
The reasons given for the denial to enter the city was that they would plunder and they would pillage and that they would loot and they would sack. And so in addition to the sentimental dimension of this decision, the Cubans felt that they were slandered.
We are a poor, ragged army, as poor as was the army of your forefathers in their noble war for independence. But like the heroes of Saratoga and Yorktown, we respect our cause too deeply to disgrace it with barbarism and cowardice. General Calixto Garcia.
The Cubans were now characterized as slouchers, as people who really had no understanding of freedom, of liberty, that these were people who themselves were fundamentally unfit for self-government.
Self-government? Why, those people are no more fit for self-government than gunpowder is for hell. As I view it, we have taken Spain's war upon ourselves. General William Shafter.
In a little rustic cottage in the far-off Philippines sits a little black-faced maiden all alone.
Spain's army in the Philippines was trapped in Intramuros, a walled city within Manila, built by Spanish conquerors 300 years earlier. Aguinaldo's insurgents had besieged the stronghold for nearly 2 months.
They had gotten Manila almost completely surrounded to the extent that the Spaniards were running low on water and food. And Aguinaldo at this point asked the Spanish commander to surrender Manila to his forces. But the Spaniards, with their sense of pride, refused to do that. They feared that the Filipinos would take vengeance on them, that the Filipinos would murder them and rape their women.
Aguinaldo hoped that Rear Admiral Dewey's fleet would bombard Intramuros and force the Spanish to surrender to the Filipinos. But Dewey had been waiting for U.S. land troops, who began arriving in July.
The Filipinos had been led to believe that the Americans were their redeemers, their liberators, and so for as long as Dewey's fleet was there, it was all right. But when the soldiers came in, then the Filipinos began to have their doubts and became suspicious about American motives. The American soldiers, on the other hand, arrived thinking that they were really going to educate these people, and a lot of them equated the Filipinos with blacks, Negroes, and they looked down on many of them.
The Filipinos were portrayed by the press in a very different way from, say, the way that the Cubans had been portrayed prior to the U.S. intervention. What was more common was to portray the Filipinos as children, so that Uncle Sam would have to come in and establish a kindergarten and would educate the Filipinos for self-government.
The Spanish proposed surrendering to the United States in a mock battle for Manila. Few soldiers would be harmed, and the Spanish would maintain their military honor. Filipinos would be kept out of Intramuros by the U.S. Army.
The Battle of Manila was another one of these things where the Spanish did not want to simply raise their hands in the air and come out surrendering. It was almost like the reenactments that you see today of Civil War battles. Everybody knew who was going to win.
The Spaniards raised the white flag, the Americans rushed into the city as planned, and the Filipinos were left holding an empty bag. Before they knew what had hit them, they were still surrounding Manila, but Manila had changed hands into the Americans.
On August 14th, in the Church of San Agustin, the Spanish handed over formal possession of Manila to the United States. And like General Garcia at Santiago, Aguinaldo and his insurgents were barred from entering the city. Filipino leaders retreated to a monastery north of Manila to organize a government independent of the United States.
The people struggle for their independence, absolutely convinced that the time has come when they can and should govern themselves. Emilio Aguinaldo.